and so too was Shadow born.
Silent Hill 2, Animal Crossing, The Last of Us, Stardew Valley, Elden Ring. What do all these games have in common? Apart from the horrors of capitalism and the horrifying capabilities of humanity, they're all, in their own way, cozy games. That's a weird thing to say, right? I mean, Shadow of the Erdtree is a cozy game. Like, that doesn't immediately register. You can kind of make sense of what I'm trying to go for, but how does an extremely difficult DLC even remotely come close to, say, I don't know, snuggling up with a blanket and rewatching episodes of Gilmore Girls?
I like that.
First of all, it's technically still summer. You always gotta wait till fall starts to rewatch Gilmore Girls. But secondly, and to the point of the video, it's because Shadow of the Erdtree isn't traditionally cozy. It isn't welcoming like Animal Crossing. It isn't warm and immediately inviting like Breath of the Wild. Shadow of the Erdtree is, on the surface, everything cozy games aren't. And yet, despite all the difficulty, all the horror-infested locations, all the melancholic music disparate to most other cozy games, Erdtree still reaches its label of cozy through the aesthetic effect it creates through its level design, art direction, and original score, deriving a feeling of comfort from its horror, a reprieve from difficulty, a moment's peace from insurmountable tension. Say it with me again. Shadow of the Erdtree is a cozy game. Elden Ring, oh Elden Ring. Abandon here a part of the discourse. Curse Baal, and welcome to Save Room. Okay, I'll admit, calling Shadow of the Erdtree a cozy game in broad strokes isn't an obvious claim, especially given the DLC's reputation and how quickly it became accepted by fans that it's the hardest and sometimes most annoying experience FromSoftware has ever produced. And if you're one of the 5 million people who played even just some of the DLC, then you truly understand. We all got rocked by Gaius. Absolutely stepped on by Rilana.
No! No way!
Black Jail Knight made us sweat probably harder than the Tree Sentinel. And Consort Radahn, well, fuck me, man. Where to even start with Radahn? It was an extremely difficult DLC. So hard even that popular streamer PsycNet had to talk to a therapist live on stream after failing to beat the DLC with 93 hours and 991 total deaths and subsequently breaking down. So, if Shadow of the Erdtree is indeed that hard, that frustrating, then how can this be cozy? There's a reason why difficulty discourse comes back around every time FromSoftware releases a new game or DLC. Not only is the combat the most tangible thing we can all talk about, but it's also the site of the most provocative emotional response any of us will have while playing one of their games. And FromSoftware always wants to exploit that. Game director Hidetaka Miyazaki hasn't shied away from admitting as such, stating in a Eurogamer article just before the release of the Erdtree DLC, "We wanted to provide these challenging encounters and these menacing threats. And in order to do that, we wanted to give the player a lot of freedom of approach. We wanted them to feel free in how they choose and when they choose to approach and tackle these hardships." And as tired as the discourse may be, I also think it's totally valid when talking about Erdtree as a cozy game, but only when paired with the question, to what effect is FromSoft leveraging difficulty? So many games within the horror and action genres operate on a similar level to Elden Ring, especially when it comes to combat. In most games, the flow of combat is designed around intense, immersive engagement aimed at progressively challenging players more and more, followed by moments of respite.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
Either through exposition, character development, inventory management, and so much more. If you've played like any major release in the last, say, 30 years, you're probably already familiar with what I'm talking about. For example, though, in Resident Evil 2, long stretches of dark, ominous hallways filled with zombies gives us that tense action where we have to worry about ammo and positioning in order to stay alive. Then, on the other side of combat, you'll reach a save room.
He said it!
A moment to collect yourself, heal, and move things around in your inventory. Downtime. We can call this sort of design tension and release. Difficult combat encounters followed by a moment's rest. And the higher the tension, the more cathartic it is to experience that release. I'll never forget nearly having some sort of anxiety episode while playing through the Rat King section of The Last of Us Part 2, where you could literally hear my exasperated breaths through the controller of my recording. And I don't use listen mode in these games, so it was just me freaking the fuck out for 5 minutes trying to survive. It was incredibly tense, but it made the feeling of finally leaving the area that much more relieving. Tension and release. Since the original Demon's Souls, FromSoftware has worked to refine this dichotomy, with the design emphasis weighted heavily toward tension through difficult combat. And we know that. Many of the normal enemies you find in Shadow of the Erdtree are as sweaty as Malenia, which in 2022 was labeled as one of the hardest fights FromSoft had ever created. That's no longer the case. Over time, the skill floor for these games has only gone up and up. But there's a reason for that. Whether it's a bonfire, a lamp, or a site of grace, reaching one of these rest areas is the cathartic release we so desperately need after fighting for our lives through poison swamps, jails, or derelict towers. Sitting down to face the glow of a grace after a night of boss attempt after boss attempt is a moment where you can finally reflect on the obstacle you just overcame. A moment of release. A catharsis. A comfort. Consort Radon was one of the hardest, most annoying, frustrating, sometimes cheap bosses I think I've ever played. But beating him was a feeling unlike no other.
Oh my god. Oh, fuck.
It doesn't matter what build or what strategy you used. If you beat him, then you did that shit. You get to have your moment of elation and your moment's rest inside the arena you died dozens of times in. In short, we have to experience the lowest lows if we want to reach the highest highs and then have that peace. And it's here where Shadow of the Erdtree as a cozy game starts to take shape. Using horror and challenge as a means of comfort isn't a new phenomenon. In fact, there are studies on this. In an article from Vice, author Abby Moss talked to Danish scholar Matthias Claesson on the psychological effect horror has on people with anxiety. In short, watching horror movies, and by extension, also playing scary or challenging games, acted as a form of exposure therapy, a way to calm the hyperactive amygdala by dosing negative emotions from scary movies or hard games. Frustrating or terrifying as games like Elden Ring or Silent Hill may be, they are ultimately a means of comfort and calming. In 2023, Claesson and a group of scholars from both Aarhus University in Denmark and the University of Chicago published a study in the American Psychological Association on this exact phenomenon, specifically in gaming. The study was called The Psychological Benefits of Scary Play in 3 Types of Horror Fans. What they found is that there are 3 separate categories for how people deal with horror and challenge. Of those sampled, those that experience negative effects, like stress, fear, anxiety, were known as white knucklers. People who would choose to experience things like horror despite the negative side effects. because of the personal development they'd find on the other side of that experience. And this makes sense for Elden Ring and why so many people enjoy playing these games. I died 586 times playing just the base game. Shadow of the Erdtree was 741 deaths, in like a third of the playtime. But no matter how difficult or frustrating the DLC got, no matter how many times I cussed out my monitor fighting the Shadow Tree avatar, it was still ultimately an enjoyable and borderline therapeutic experience for me on the other side. This is the appeal of these games after all. To face challenges and certain death over and over again. To fail in an attempt to grow, all to eventually succeed. Psychological studies like this suddenly puts all the difficulty discourse into perspective. It's not just that there's fun to be had in overcoming a hard boss like Mesmer, but that there's personal growth in the struggle and positive psychological effects in playing through all of the tense, horrifying, nearly impossible fights you barely make it out of time and time again. Rolana was the first Remembrance boss I encountered in the DLC. I had done a fair amount of exploration, but was around Shadow Tree Blessing 5 or so, which means the boss fight was tough. Fair, but tough. It was the first actual skill check moment, where I realized just how much hands Erdtree really had, and how much I needed to lock in. It didn't go well for a while. I'd respawn at the castle checkpoint over and over again, switching my talismans, switching my weapons, switching my ashes of war, running to the fog gate, again and again and again. Sometimes I'd get close. Sometimes she'd be one hit, but it always ended the same.
No! No way!
Fighting Rolana was sweaty work. It was hard. Fun? Absolutely. But nonetheless, almost physically demanding. So, when I finally killed her, it was like releasing an incalculable amount of pressure I was holding at my shoulders, at my jaw, at my fingers, at my forehead. It was the tension dissolving away. It was an incredible moment, one of many to come. And my reaction was to sit, to rest at the moon-gazing grounds, to see Rolana's lone chair standing in isolation, to watch the ghosts of other players move about the waters, to hear the melancholic hums of Castle Ensis transform from ominous preparation now to ambient relaxation. And when I was ready, when I was rested and comforted, I got up and left. Waiting for me on the other side was the foggy milk golden sky of the Shadow Altus. Even though it had been 2 nights of challenging combat, the result was somehow complete tranquility. Look, I know overcoming difficulty on its own isn't enough to call Shadow of the Erdtree cozy. No. For that, we have to leave discourse behind and take a look at everything the game is doing outside of combat. A dive into the ins and outs of what makes the Land of Shadow a homely place. A melancholic exploration of the fantastical macabre. It's hard to put into words just how breathtaking the scenery is in Shadow of the Erdtree. There's never really been anything like it before. From the veiled vistas that hang below the Shadow Tree, the gold-curtained skies of Inner Elam, the ocean fields of the Cerulean coast, and foregrounded crescent moon over Jagged Peak, to the dampened depths of the Stone Fissure, dank corners of abandoned finger ruins, and many, many more. And given how dense the DLC is, there's sure to be another inspired horizon waiting for you to bask in around every corner. The base version of Elden Ring had moments just like this, of stopping you right in your tracks to admire unbelievable scenery. You could look up in astonishment at the size of the Erdtree, stare over onto the foggy cliffs of Liurnia, and dive hundreds of feet below the surface to gaze upon the captured stars that shine above Shifra River. These were all special in their own right. Unforgettable, even. But Shadow of the Erdtree really tripled down on wanting to overwhelm you with beautiful art direction as often as possible. And thanks to artists Hidenori Sato and Ryo Fujimaki, the scenery of Erdtree truly helped push the game to mesmerizing new heights. But it's not just landscapes that make Elden Ring's visuals striking on their own. Rather, the feeling you get when staring out at one of them. The sheer size of them. Their placement and existence within the map. Their inspired design. All of this produces an aesthetic effect that goes back to our notion of Erdtree as cozy. In these moments of beauty and reflection, gazing out beyond the horizon, we're meant to feel something. Inspirations for Elden Ring's design are already pretty widely talked about, especially with a lot of the Souls content creators. In her video, How Elden Ring Balances Darkness with Beauty, Eurothug4000 talks about the visual similarities between Liurnia and Friedrich's painting Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog. If you're interested to hear more about Elden Ring's aesthetics, I highly recommend watching Maria's video. Further, articles like Gareth Martin's in ArtReview highlight Elden Ring's inspiration from painters like Hieronymus Bosch and Gustave Doré. And of course, who could forget FromSoft's long-running references to Kentaro Miura's manga series Berserk, literally any chance they get. All of these collectively help produce that amorphous aesthetic effect I mentioned earlier. The can't put my finger on it, weird mixed feeling that lies somewhere between horror and comfort when faced with Elden Ring's art direction. But how do we get from an aesthetic effect all the way to calling the game cozy? Well, for that we go back to feeling, and above all else, there's really only one word that encapsulates how it feels to look at and explore Shadow of the Erdtree's locations. Sublime. After completing the initial quests for Count Ymir, and ringing the bells at the Finger Ruins, you can return back to Manse Midra and begin your search for the third hanging bell. Pushing back the throne, you find a hidden entrance. A ladder leading deep underground. You start scaling it down. After a few feet, the ground beneath the castle opens up to a massive, sapphire-colored cavern, a clandestine grave of dead fingers. It's an unreal sight. Infernal. Ungodly. And yet, it provokes something. A feeling beyond the initial burst of the eerie. A lingering feeling of curiosity and amazement that something this unearthly could be down here. In this moment, it's not just your mind that tries to process what you're seeing, but your emotions as well. This is Shadow of the Erdtree operating on the sublime. Of being moved by its art design where we can barely process what we're looking at or how it came to be. But knowing that we'll continue to face whatever it is, just the same. Shadow of the Erdtree is loaded with dozens of these moments, all in their own unique ways. Sometimes the sublime is in fathoming the sheer size of the map, gazing out from the top of Rua Base and seeing all the locations you've explored before even arriving here, seeing how far you've come. Other times, it's squeezing through a hole in the ground off the Cerulean coast and discovering an entire world of giant coffins drenched in violet-covered fog, knowing full well you'll have to make your way deeper into whatever this place is. And if that wasn't enough to evoke some sort of emotional response, then the unnatural line of animals sitting in wait for something I persuade you otherwise. It's a strange intersection to be at, between horror and comfort, but one that nonetheless still works. Whether it's the plains of Red Dead 2, the statue of an engineer in Prometheus, an ocean horizon in Animal Crossing, wet residuals of beach things in Death Stranding, a distant Hogwarts in Harry Potter, or the corpse of a fallen dragon in Shadow of the Erdtree. The intent is all the same: to produce an aesthetic effect from the visuals, from the art direction, to be supplanted in that space and have your senses overwhelmed. And it's in that emotional response where that sentiment of cozy can truly be accessed, be realized. Meditating in the storm-soaked fields of a ruined coast is really no different than a picnic on the pier. The effect is just the same. All of this is, of course, by design. Miyazaki himself has been quoted about the focus of contrasting the horror and challenge of their worlds with moments of beauty and the sublime. Just before the release of Shadow of the Erdtree, in an article by The Guardian, Miyazaki had this to say about Elden Ring's direction. Instead of the very grim, dark fantasy that you may be used to from past FromSoftware games, it still has that same harshness and coldness. But we wanted to have these moments of beauty. That's where a little bit of high fantasy comes in, conceptually. Both in terms of the difficulty and the learning curve, as well as the world setting. You feel that you can come up for air. And Erdtree has these moments in spades, of letting you breathe in its splendor, despite the tragedy that exists in the periphery. There's the Shaman village, where Marika and the history of the minor Erdtree that never grew is offset by its field of flowers and its sky of outstretched gold. There's the sights of Mikola's Crossings, where character lore is balanced out with visuals of a crescent moon and kindling from the base's glow. And while the fate of Saint Trina is certainly tragic, not even the arena of the putrid night could wash away a lover's den that remains in bloom. If the base game of Elden Ring is the exploration of a dark wasteland past decay, then Erdtree is the breath you've longed to fill your lungs, to soak in its sublime comfort. A moment's peace. Cozy. I realize that waxing poetic for minutes on end about just the art direction of Erdtree kind of sounds like I'm glazing FromSoftware. First of all, shame on you. It's not glazing. It's analysis. You should know this. Secondly, even if it is, it doesn't make the aesthetic effect not true. For every moment of fear and desperation that we find in combat, for every death from literally any of the main bosses, every shout at Bale,
Curse you, Bale!
There's another moment of reprieve, another sight to behold, another field of flowers, another group of these cute little guys, another embrace from the melancholic warmth of a world suspended in beautiful liminality for us to sit in peaceful solace. It helps that the music for Shadow of the Erdtree soaks you deeper into those residual feelings of the sublime. I'd argue it's actually an integral part of what makes Erdtree as cozy as it is, even if it's less noticeable. Sure, when we think of Elden Ring's score, we think of the swelling theme from the main menu. We think of the incredible and overwhelming orchestral backing to the Bale fight. We think of the Consort Radam theme we heard over and over and over again. And while these are all well and good, it's the quiet underlining score that informs the DLC the most. Most horror games we think of as now strangely comforting experiences will often leverage music as a way to create reprieve, to come up for air, as Miyazaki puts it. In Silent Hill 2, Akira Yamaoka's score emphasized drums, synths, and minor keys to emphasize a dreamy, melancholic sound. Likewise, Gustavo Santaolalla's score in The Last of Us frequently returned to notes that would evoke a warm and hopeful tone, mirroring the growing relationship between Joel and Ellie. And just like the psychological studies of horror games on anxiety, there are 2 statistics on the effect of music. Even though much of the music in Shadow of the Erdtree is what I'd call dark, depressing, sad, what have you, it still ultimately underlines the DLC as a cozy game. In fact, many other more traditional cozy games house similar melancholic scores. The original Life is Strange excelled at this, walking a fine line between soft, gentle guitar-plucking strings and an overwhelming sadness behind those same minor strings. And Outer Wilds' Timber Hearth theme balances a sense of exploration with its lead strings while foregrounding melancholy with its opening rhythm guitar. Whether it's traditional horror or an outright cozy game, or something in between, the result can often end up largely the same. To pull the spectrum from either end back toward a feeling of the bittersweet. To somehow find solace in the plucking or drone of minor chords. To be comforted despite decay and desolation. Biological reports like this one published in Sage Journals talk about the emotional effects of listening to sad music like we find in Shadow of the Erdtree. The result is a higher production of dopamine and prolactin levels, which, in short, offsets feelings like fear, sadness, and anxiety by boosting feelings of calmness, comfort, and sometimes pleasure. While perhaps not as thematically overt as games like The Last of Us, Shadow of the Erdtree does use its music to similar effect. Whether it be plucks from a harp, lengthened hums from strings of violins, or dreary rings from piano keys. All of them together cushion us while exploring to emphasize that same feeling of comfort we find when admiring locations around the world. It's what makes reaching sites like the Shaman village so striking. To be overwhelmed by a moment of nothing else than just the fields in front of you, and to hear the slow, individual plucks from an ethereal harp. To bask in the ambiance. To find comfort. But just like with the intent of difficulty we talked about earlier, it's the effect the DLC wants to produce with its art direction and music together that makes Erdtree the cozy game it ultimately becomes. Deep below the castle and through the valleys that pour out from the edges that support Shadowkeep is the entrance to perhaps the most bone-chilling area of all of Shadow of the Erdtree, where the waters that soak the frigid ground are polluted with the afterbirth of frenzied flames, where the fog that licks the limbs of emaciated trees wraps itself around the sky like cobwebs from some unknown cosmic force, and the leaves hang like rotten mashes of decayed pulp, where not even your steed dares to show its face, running away in absolute fear, leaving you to walk the desperate broken cobble roads alone. I'm talking, of course, about the Abyssal Woods. Walking further into the woods from the entrance is a horrifying experience unlike no other in all of Elden Ring. It's one of the few moments where messages written by the developers line the floor, all telling you to hide, to not make a sound, to not be seen, to not even fight, that combat is not an option. On guard throughout the forest are the aging untouchables, enemies that quite literally can't be hit. And while the reality is that you can parry them to disable their immunity, when you're overwhelmed by multiple enemies all patrolling a single area, unless you want to run away chugging swigs from your flask, then your best bet is stealth your entire way through. Moving between flowers and tall grass is perhaps one of the most tense moments in all the DLC that does not directly involve combat. Coupled with the ominous score of a shrieking voice and distant reverberation, the Abyssal Woods is perhaps The singular location where the game is at its most tense, most anxiety-inducing, most horrific. So, again, how can something like this, where there is no post-combat reprieve to quell your senses, no melancholic music to assuage you toward comfort, how can an area so ominously terrifying possibly be cozy in any considerable way? In that same psychological study of the benefits of playing horror, researchers found a third category for how a player interprets tense, anxious, and/or horrifying moments. They called this group of people dark copers. People that, like white knucklers, found horrifying experience to lead to reflection and comfort from the personal growth found from the experience. But with a twist. Dark copers found the negative effects from horror, stress, anxiety, tension, fear, to be exciting. That the intense experience was actually a good feeling based on knowing how they'd feel on the other side. For these people, facing horror was an invitation, a path to comfort. Some researchers have argued that humans possess morbid curiosity, a motivation to engage with or otherwise gather information about many of the themes that are central to horror fiction, such as body disgust, the paranormal, violence, and minds of dangerous people. I think, for a lot of people, including myself, engaging with the most horrifying aspects of Shadow of the Erdtree functions the same way we would organizing clothes and unpacking or tending to the weeds in Animal Crossing. That there is comfort in confronting some kind of difficulty or obstacle in front of you. That the work itself is part of the enjoyment as much as the satisfaction after. This is where our definition of cozy rears its head the largest, vague as it might be. Whether it's fighting a monumentally challenging boss, exploring a decrepit jail, or running from the fires that burn the fields that stand before the foot of furnace golems. Shadow of the Erdtree returns to the same sentiment time and time again. That exploring the land of shadow is, in its own, a rite of self-voyeurism to reach an aesthetic effect. That horror and music and difficulty all feed into positive feelings of comfort we can apply not just to the next area we encounter in the game, but to the next obstacle we'll face out in the real world. More than anything, Miyazaki is aware of this phenomenon. That he leads games with this design framework in mind, always balancing challenge with comfort from the response of said challenge. In the same Guardian interview for Shadow of the Erdtree, Miyazaki says, "A lot of FromSoftware games throw players into this barren wasteland, and it's a very severe, harsh, cold experience. I don't think what we've been doing in our games has changed, but perhaps the world has come closer to that type of feeling. These past few years have been a huge exception to the rule in terms of what's happening around us. But even before that, I have always felt that the world was quite a harsh place. I've always lived my life with that worldview, those values. So this idea of being thrust into a wasteland and planting the seeds of growth is something that, for me, feels almost universal. Perhaps more people are discovering that right now." This is where the effect of all of Erdtree's friction points towards it as a secret cozy game. That in its decaying worlds, its seemingly insurmountable battles, all of it is working as an interpolation of the indomitable human spirit to persevere. And I think there's a real comfort in that. At grinding away our own anxieties, our own egos, and our own fears to get to a place of quiet reflection, a positive meditation on the other side of all that darkness. And many games operate on this same aesthetic effect, both in horror genres and more traditional cozy games. For many people, again, like myself, The Last of Us can also be considered a cozy game, not for all its tense combat or survival horror design, but for the way it develops character relationships, for the way it attempts a sense of restoration within Joel through his relationship with Ellie. In Erdtree, the group fight with Needle Knight Leda is the culmination of the side quests you've encountered with each of the NPCs from the DLC. And as tragic as the fight may be, as dramatic as it's presented, in the end, it's still yet another affirmation of the relationships you built and the obstacles you've overcome. It is the direct outcome of a storyline that was made for the Dark Coper gamer. And this makes me think of cozy games writ large. Maybe the inverse of Dark Copers and the environments of the Land of Shadow could be something like Hyrule in both Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild, where the joy and comfort of exploring the beautiful and often friendly locales of Hyrule could be for people labeled something like light copers. Personal development through warm, inviting, and exciting experiences. Really, most cozy games are defined by this sentiment. Animal Crossing, Zelda, Stardew, these are all the result of engaging with characters and the environment to better yourself in some kind of way. Shadow of the Erdtree is just the reverse end of that coin. The same result by different, more difficult, and more terrifying ends. Personal development through tension and struggle. A cozy game, just the same, through and through. Of course, the result of Dark Copers engaging with Shadow of the Erdtree has led to many other comforting things beyond aesthetic effect. Community messages around the Land of Shadow litter the ground with messages like Fortnite, Mist or Beast, and I want to go home and then Edge. There are infamous players like the invader Drip Inspector, who comes to judge the clothes you're wearing in the game. And of course, there are the countless lore videos you can watch on YouTube, where creators like Vati Vidya or Miss Chalice produce such pleasant and soothing videos that they become something like bedtime stories or ASMR videos about the world of Elden Ring. And indeed, there are, of course, proper ASMR videos as well.
You are looking rather battle-worn.
Look, I know Shadow of the Erdtree isn't a traditional cozy game. It doesn't have the hospitable worlds that those games normally do. Erdtree is a game that creates friction, leverages challenge and difficulty at every turn, elevates setting to maximize horror, and drowns its own world in the sounds of dreary, melancholic sounds. But it's the effect of all these things combined to inform the DLC as more than just the hardest thing FromSoftware has ever produced. Because, really, Erdtree is a game that instills in us more than just its challenge. It bathes us in humble meditation, soaks us in sublime wonder, embraces us in quiet, comforting strings, all to help push us to the other side. Shadow of the Erdtree is not the game you think it is. It's comforting, welcoming, and filled with the aesthetic effect of darkness and tension to reach positive reprieve and reflection. Shadow of the Erdtree is a cozy game. Let me know what you think of Shadow of the Erdtree. Did you find it as comforting as I did? Or am I just glazing Miyazaki? I'll be waiting for you down in the comments. Until next time, my name is Christian. This is Save Room, and we'll see you in the next one.